Welcome back to the reading of the book Prayer by M.L. Andreasen. We are on chapter 24, titled The Lord's Prayer, and we are reading the fourth section of this chapter, and that is titled, Thy Will Be Done. Thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. This petition is built on the fact that God's will is not now being done in earth. If God's will were done, there would be no war or hatred among nations. There would be no injustice or cruelty, no sickness, sorrow, suffering, or tears. Peace and prosperity would prevail. Joy and happiness reign supreme. How have present conditions come about? They are the result of the selfishness, ambition, and greed of men who have forgotten that they are their brother's keeper. As a consequence, some nations have an abundance of that for which others are starving. There is enough food in the world for all, but men have not learned the blessing of sharing with those who are less fortunate. Men have forgotten the golden rule. They have forgotten God. God's will is well expressed by the prophet who said, I know the thoughts that I think toward you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end. Jeremiah 29, verse 11. The Revised Standard Version more correctly reads, I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. When this was written, Israel had sinned grievously, and it appeared that there was no future for them. But God had plans for them and encouraged them to try once more. He promised that if they would search for him with all their heart, he would hear them and would turn their captivity. Jeremiah 39, verses 12 through 14. God is not an angry God who lies in wait to catch men off their guard so he can punish them. Hear these heartening promises. God doth not afflict willingly nor grieve the children of men. Lamentations 3, verse 33. If God at times must punish, he does it reluctantly. He is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. 2 Peter 3, verse 9. His desire is to have all men to be saved and to come unto the knowledge of the truth. 1 Timothy 2, verse 4. From the very beginning, God has chosen you to salvation through sanctification of the Spirit and belief of the truth. 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 13. This is the will of God, even your sanctification. 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 3. These texts reveal God's plan for men, all men. He wants every man saved and is not willing that even one should be lost. His plan includes both a hope and a future, on the condition that we seek him with all our heart. When we therefore pray that God's will be done in earth as it is in heaven, we align ourselves with divine power to bring this about. Just what, specifically, does God want us to do so that he can work out his plan in us? What is my duty? A government expresses its will through its laws. Each nation ordinarily has a fundamental law, written or unwritten, generally called a constitution, which is binding upon all the people. This constitution prescribes and defines the duties of the citizens and is the standard to which all other laws must conform. In a country ruled by a dictator, there is no constitution. The will of the dictator is the supreme law, from which there is no appeal. When God formed Israel into a nation, he publicly entered into a covenant with the people, upon adherence to which they were to become his people and receive his blessings. Moses thus records the event. And ye came near and stood under the mountain, and the mountain burned with fire unto the midst of heaven, with darkness, clouds, and thick darkness. And the Lord spake unto you out of the midst of the fire. Ye heard the voice of the words, but saw no similitude, only ye heard a voice. And he declared unto you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, even 10 commandments, and he wrote them upon 2 tables of stone. Deuteronomy 4, verses 11 through 13. The covenant law which God proclaimed from Sinai reads as follows. Quote, God spake all these words, saying, 1. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. 2. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in the heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me, and keep my commandments. 3. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. 4. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gate. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and hallowed it. 5. Honor thy father and thy mother, that the days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. 6. Thou shalt not kill. 7. Thou shalt not commit adultery. 8. Thou shalt not steal. 9. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. 10. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. These words the Lord spake unto all your assembly in the mount out of the midst of the fire, of the cloud, and of the thick darkness, with a great voice. And he added no more. And he wrote them in 2 tables of stone, and delivered them unto me. Deuteronomy 5, verse 22. And I turned myself, and came down from the mount, and put the tables in the ark which I had made. And there they be, as the Lord commanded me. Deuteronomy 10, verse 5. This law was endorsed by Christ in his Sermon on the Mount, and compliance with it was made a condition of salvation. From early Christian experience, I had been taught that in religion there was no place for independent judgment, that I was not to use my mind, but to trust in God and have faith. The advice was well meant and is largely true. We are to have faith, and we are saved by faith and not by works. But the suggestion that we are not to use our minds is entirely untrue. We are to serve God with our mind as well as with the other faculties. Hear these words of Christ. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind, and with all thy strength. This is the first commandment. And the second is like, namely this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. There is none other commandment greater than these. Mark 12, verses 30 and 31. See also Matthew 22, verse 37, and Luke 10, 27. As a fresh breath from heaven come the words, Come now, and let us reason together, saith the Lord. Isaiah 1:18. Is it possible that God invites me to reason with him? Paul supported the idea when he said, Consider what I say, and the Lord give thee understanding in all things. 2 Timothy 2, verse 7. Consider is defined to look at closely, to examine, to think about, to ponder in order to understand and decide, to observe, comprehend. Did Paul mean that I have a right to consider what he said, to think it over? And what did he mean when he said, I speak as to wise men, judge ye what I say? 1 Corinthians 10, verse 5. Perhaps we had expected to hear Paul say, swallow what I say. Instead of this, he appealed to men's good sense and told them to consider what he said. He was so sure of his grounds that he was willing to leave the decision with the hearers. God is pleased when we use the mind He has given us and seriously consider a matter before taking action. Such is not an act of disbelief, but of intelligent faith. There must indeed be no doubtful hesitation in obeying God, but ordinarily He gives us time for reflection that we may see light in His light and follow on to know the Lord. Little children should be taught to obey without questioning, but as the child grows older, the wise parents will use a different method. They will spend time in explaining the reasons for certain requirements, and as the child gets the parent's viewpoint, there will be intelligent cooperation, unless the child is willfully stubborn. It is thus God deals with us. He wants to reason with us. He wants us to consider, to judge. God treats us as grown-ups, which always appeals to a child. As we think matters through, we see wisdom in what might otherwise seem an arbitrary and unreasonable demand. God could sit on His throne and issue His sovereign decrees without giving any reason for them, but He chooses the better way. He reveals His secrets to His servants, the prophets. Amos 3 verse 7. He talked things over with Abraham before destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. Genesis 18 verses 20 through 33. He would never dare give us the right to think, did He not know that when we have time to consider the matter, we will agree with Him. How can any fail to appreciate such a God? He makes us feel that we count. We are not mere automatons. Let no one misunderstand. God demands obedience, but He talks things over with us and leaves us to the final decision. While, generally speaking, every request which God makes of us is a reasonable request, there are times when He tests us to see what we will do under certain circumstances. He tests us to see if we have learned to trust Him absolutely, and if we will obey orders even without understanding them. Of such was the order to Simon Peter. Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a draught. Luke 5 verse 4. Christ was no fisherman, and Peter was. Also, Peter had been fishing all night and caught nothing, and in daylight it was no use to try again. Peter made a weak protest, verse 5, then let down his net, and the result was a greater catch than Peter had ever had before. This was Peter's first lesson in obedience. Years later, when Christ told him to cast the net on the right side, there was no arguing. John 21 verse 6. Peter could readily have argued that there were no more fish on the right side than on the left, but he had learned his lesson. When Abraham was told to take his son Isaac and offer him on the mountain God should show him, he did not hesitate. Genesis 22 verses 2 and 3. He could not understand, but in previous years he had learned to trust God. Abraham stood the test for obedience. These are interesting events, and there are others in the Bible. God likes to talk things over with His men to prepare them for the time when there must be prompt and instant obedience. God's will in me. It is well to pray that God's will be done in earth as it is in heaven, for that calls our minds to fields far and near where God's will is not being done or even known, and where we might be of some help. If we Christians pray this prayer, we cannot be inactive, for we have it in our power to help answer the prayer. When Christ said, "This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come," Matthew 24 verse 14, He was depending on us to do our part. He knew that such preaching was necessary if God's will was to be done. By our work with our neighbors, by our interest in fields afar, we may, in a very definite way, speed the day when God's will shall be done in the earth. There is, however, a very personal application of this prayer that is of more importance than anything we can do for others. That is accepting God's will for ourselves. If we do this, and our life becomes a God-directed life, He will be enabled to use us in ways we do not now understand or think possible. In the abstract, it is easy to pray, "Thy will be done." Are we willing to make it personal? It must have been a momentous disappointment for Moses when he was put aside and not permitted to enter the promised land, and Joshua was given his place. He pleaded for permission to go in and see the land, but this prayer was denied. Deuteronomy 3, verses 23 through 27. As for Joshua, said God to Moses, "Encourage him and strengthen him, for he shall go over before this people, and he shall cause them to inherit the land." Verse 28. Moses bowed to the will of God, and on his behalf he gave Joshua the son of Nun a charge and said, "Be strong and of a good courage, for thou shalt bring the children of Israel into the land which I swear unto them, and I will be with thee." Deuteronomy 31, verse 23. Moses did not enter the earthly Canaan. He died, and God raised him from the grave in immortal glory. Elijah must have been much discouraged when, after the great day on Mount Carmel, where he did mighty exploits for God and won a signal victory, God rebuked him for his cowardly flight from Jezebel and told him to put his mantle on Elisha. But he did not murmur. When he found Elisha, he cast his mantle upon him. 1 Kings 19, verse 19. But God had not forsaken Elijah. He and Elisha worked together until Elisha was fully able to take over the work. Then one day, as they walked along talking together, behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. 2 Kings 2, verse 11. Elijah's work on earth was done, so God took him to heaven. It must have been hard for Paul, the active and energetic one, to sit still in prison day after day and year after year. In the midst of a busy and useful life, he was placed on the sidelines, his work apparently done, though he was still in the strength of manhood and planning a worldwide work. Or was his work done? No, God was merely changing his work. He had been so busy traveling and preaching that he had not had time to do the writing God wanted done. There was yet a great deal of the New Testament to be written, and Paul was the man to do it, but he was too busy. He needed quietness and freedom from the care of the churches. So God arranged for him a time of quietness, and Paul immediately went to work. By writing 14 of the 27 books of the New Testament, he doubtless did more good than he did during his active ministry. Paul was willing to be set aside, and in his retirement he did a mighty work for God. He had learned, in whatever state he was, therewith to be content. What shall we say of John the Baptist? He had done a valiant work for God in preaching the way for Christ, and now that his work was done, he was consigned to prison and apparently forgotten. Did envy and jealousy fill his heart with discontent as a greater one had taken his place? No, 1,000 times no. Said he, "He must increase, but I must decrease." John 3, verse 30. Had Christ forgotten him? Among them that are born of women, there hath not risen a greater than John the Baptist. Matthew 11:11. It is not easy to say, "Thy will be done," when one is set aside. But the men we have mentioned had learned the lesson. So Moses and Joshua appeared together, and Moses strengthened and encouraged Joshua. Elijah and Elisha walked and talked together, and the younger man was instructed by the older. Paul willingly changed his work and accomplished more than ever, and John cheerfully stepped aside when a greater than he appeared. All these accepted God's way, though it must have cost some of them great sorrow. All of them learned one of life's greatest lessons: to bow to disappointment, to say, "Thy will be done," and cheerfully to do what God had for them to do. It is not easy to be set aside, but this is part of the program of life. He that can bow to the will of God, who can say from the heart, "Thy will be done," may be set at another task where he can still serve. There may be those among the readers who have been set aside and resent it. Let us repeat, this is part of life, a lesson that all must learn. There may be wives who have been put aside and are passing through the experience of loneliness and of not being wanted. There may be grandparents who once had a happy home where all were welcome. Now they are given a rocking chair in a corner and are given to understand that they are not to make themselves too prominent when company comes. There are those who have held high office in state or church or institutions. Their counsel, which once was sought eagerly, is not in demand any more. They are outdated. The shock is almost unbearable for some persons. It is easy enough to say that God's will be done when all goes well, but it is not easy to say this when a loved one is on the deathbed and hope is gone. It is not easy to say it when we are personally involved, when we are incapacitated and feel we are in the way and our usefulness is at an end. It was not easy for Christ to say it in Gethsemane, but he did say it, and a world was saved. Frustrations and disappointments are a part of life and an important part, for in the darkness God may be hid. If we relate ourselves rightly to reverses and disappointments, they may become His appointments. If we accept the disappointments as ordered or permitted by God, we may see God's will being done in our reaction. Therefore, let all pray, Thy will be done in me.